team. I'll just repeat some of the housekeeping that Matt just briefly introduced us to. So we will be recording the session, so please keep your camera off if you don't wish to be seen on screen. Please also mute your microphone. We will have an opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask questions, so if you want to put those in the chat, I'll monitor that as we go through. Or alternatively, raise your hands at the end, and if you wish to ask a question, I'll come and invite you to speak. Please, if you can, turn your camera on at that stage if you're comfortable to do so. Okay, without further ado, I have the great honour of introducing Professor Sir Peter Scott, Emeritus Professor of Higher Education Studies at the University College London. Peter's had a brilliant career, firstly as a journalist and former editor of the Times Higher Education, before working in higher education. He was Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of Leeds and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Kingston until 2010. He has been heavily influential in many areas, not least widening participation and fair access, a subject close to my heart, working at a university with significant numbers of widening participation students. Peter was a member of the Higher Education Funding Council for England and chaired the Widening Participation Strategic Committee and held the first position of Commissioner for Fair Access in Scotland. He has published widely on education and widening access. Peter was knighted for services to education in 2007. Peter's talk today resonates heavily with me as a HE planner, particularly the push and pull of external and internal priorities and the changing prominence of the function at universities and the increasing role of governing bodies in the area. I'm very much looking forward to listening to his insight. Thank you, Peter. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Have I got my slides? No. Yes, okay, good. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the conference today, even though it's inevitably a rather somber day. First of all, I have to apologise for what is a rather unimaginative title that doesn't give much away. But you know how it is, you're asked a few months before to give a conference talk, and you inevitably choose something pretty broad so that it will cover almost anything you want to say. But I hope that what I'm going to say today will not be so banal and be a bit more focused and perhaps even a bit controversial. It must be 10 years since I last spoke at an HER conference, and so much has changed since then. I mean, some changes, we must hope, will be temporary. A decade ago, no one imagined that life could be so fundamentally changed by a pandemic like COVID, because we thought those kind of things belonged in the Middle Ages, not the 21st century. That conference 10 years ago inevitably, of course, was in person, and now we've got very used, perhaps too used, to meeting via Zoom or Teams. And more generally, work and less certainly, I think, study patterns have been radically shifted. But then other changes, I think, have been more fundamental and maybe even possibly irreversible, certainly in England. And back then, the fairly new coalition government was just getting into its stride. Brexit was unimagined and probably unimaginable. HEFCE hadn't been replaced by the Office for Students. And no one really talked much about culture wars or woke culture or things like that. And if we look more broadly, getting away from this rather narrow kind of Anglo-centric view and look more globally, I mean, 10 years ago, so-called populism and the kind of geopolitical events that have ensued since had not yet kind of reshaped prospects for internationalization and to some degree pushed universities onto the back foot, now being accused of being kind of bastions of elitism, technocratic expertise, flawed cosmopolitanism, and so on. So the first thing I want to do is to set the scene. And the best way to do that, I think, is to get rid of a lot of the kind of policy noise, I like to call it. You know, the latest regulation or statement from OFS or ministers in full performative flow, and try to focus on the big and enduring changes. And I also want to do justice to Scotland, Wales and Ireland, where just as interesting things have been happening, but maybe without some of the ideological drama. Next, I want to say something about how strategy and planning in universities evolved in response to these big changes. and maybe also some of the noise, which we can't entirely ignore because it consumes some of our daily and weekly and monthly lives. But it does seem to me there has been a shift away of emphasis away from grand mission statements, obviously often expressed in rather utopian or certainly normative language, to a new language of targets and delivery, more often backed by much more sophisticated data analysis. And I think that's a fundamental shift. And finally, I want to look at the impact of these changes on two key elements in universities: governing bodies, which is, of course, where my title comes in, and inevitably planning units and departments, which do the heavy lifting, and hopefully rely not just on data analytics in a narrow sense, but wider institutional research capacity. So, setting the scene. I just said I wanted to distinguish between two big important things and the more ephemeral noise. It's a lovely distinction by the French historian Ferdinand Braudel between the long haul and what he calls the history of events. And he's much more interested in the long haul. And occasionally I think we should try and focus on the long haul and get rid of the history of events. So I want to focus on two things, as I said, that we talk about a lot, but actually are probably, if we're honest, never going to happen. The first is that we have too many people going to universities. But the mass expansion of higher education is never going to be thrown into reverse. The opportunity to go to higher education is far too embedded in individual aspirations and social expectations now. Survey after survey has shown that even people from really quite poor backgrounds want that opportunity for their children, more fiercely perhaps, precisely because they themselves were denied that opportunity. And that appetite, frankly, is not going to disappear. And of course, survey after survey has also shown that the number of higher skill jobs, of the kinds filled by graduates, will expand and the number of lower skill jobs will decline. And of course, the figures, the actual demand for places in higher education speak for themselves. So a lot of talk about universities being too large or we're producing too many overgraduates. It's simply, in my view, spitting in the wind. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the kind of social positioning of higher education hasn't changed fundamentally in ways that may dismay conservatives and elitists, which I think sometimes explains the tendency to assert that only a place in one of our best universities really counts. Nor does it mean, of course, that the much higher rate of return on higher education, as too crudely measured, I think, by easy access to well-paid jobs, won't vary significantly, and often sometimes in quite surprising ways, not hierarchical ways. But the simple truth, again, is that we have become a graduate society and increasingly a graduate economy, like every other advanced society and economy in the world. So there's no going back there either. Now, I think this irreversibility of mass higher education is sometimes misunderstood. This happens because we don't focus on the wood, i.e. the inexorable movement towards ever higher levels of participation in education beyond school, and obsess instead about the trees, a rather kind of snob-ridden hierarchy of universities, a kind of supposed distinction between academic and vocational and professional education, which I think under current conditions, looking at the range of courses in higher education, is a largely spurious distinction now. Now, the truth is that the future, as well as being mass, I think will be tertiary. Comprehensive systems embracing higher education, further education, on-the-job training, and I personally very much hope adult learning as well. I think this has been recognised in Wales. Scotland has made a stab at it with its Learner Journey initiative. Only in England, I think, has the tertiary future been interpreted rather negatively and unimaginatively in kind of adversarial terms of competition between sectors and types. Too many universities, too many students in universities, too few in further education, that kind of thing. You're very familiar with the debate. The second thing after the irreversibility of mass higher education that isn't going to change, and therefore isn't really worth discussing, is all this talk about the small state. The state is not going to butt out of higher education. In that sense, all supposed markets in higher education are illusory. And universities are also never going to go back to the Arcadian days of fondly remembered, but probably largely mythical, extreme autonomy. If you examine the detail, a lot of the supposed distinction between kind of managed or state-funded and market systems of higher education falls away, not surprisingly, because the broader distinction itself between private and public is increasingly porous under modern conditions. It's often actually an artifact of accounting rules which can be changed, as happened to student loans in England. And on a wider canvas, one of the most dynamic areas of the UK economy and many other economies is what I like to call the parastate, that sprawling borderland between traditional public services on the one hand and truly free market activities on the other. To choose two rather in the news examples in the UK, train operating companies or water companies. And as often is the case, I think the language of politics and policy doesn't actually match these underlying realities. I think this is very apparent in higher education. In England, the UK government has taken powers over universities that previous governments would have regarded, frankly, as overweening, which the Scottish and Welsh governments don't have and presumably don't want. The Office for Students gets involved in matters, for example, definitions of anti-Semitism, free speech, degree classifications, low value for money courses, etc., that were firmly seen outside the remit of its predecessor, HEFCE. Leaving aside for a moment the kind of gross politicization, which I'll discuss in a minute, these powers have been acquired and this level of involvement accepted in the case of better regulation to protect the interests of consumers, students in this case. But the practical result is the state as regulator is probably far more intrusive than the state as funder ever was. For a start, it takes on itself almost exclusively the right to define the public interest, and rather more worryingly, perhaps the student interest as well, whatever students themselves may think. And of course, there's never really been a good distinction between funding and regulation, except in terms perhaps of political ideology or kind of academic theorizing. I'm not trying here to score polemical points. Mass higher education systems, like school systems, require large-scale state investment. But whether that investment is provided through direct grants to institutions or state guaranteed and provided loans to students is essentially, I believe, a technical and secondary matter. But the state's stake is not only necessary and inevitable, it's also desirable. In its earliest English language formulation, the state was actually called the Commonwealth, i.e. an expression of shared interest. And today there are vital public interests at stake in higher education. The opportunity for individuals to realize their potential and themselves through education beyond school. The thriving of democratic opportunities, the acquisition of economically vital skills, the expansion of human knowledge. So just as we're never going to be able to reverse mass expansion, or should we try, we're never going to be able to get the state, the public in a wider sense, out of higher education. Let me move on to some other key policy trends, which I'll list more briefly. Politicization, which I mentioned a moment ago. In the UK, of course, this is most pronounced in post-Brexit England, but it's a global trend, and it's at its most extreme perhaps in the United States. In the culture wars and the war on woke, it's now routine for right-wing politicians to demonize universities, as I said earlier, bastions of right wing, of elite privilege, cosmopolitan values, etc. And from the left, there's been an equally intrusive rise of identity-based Puritanism and intolerance. Well, the universities have never been strangers to controversies. This is a whole new ballgame, it seems to me, and one that inevitably colours strategizing and policymaking. Planning. I hesitated before listing this as a key policy trend. Of course, at institutional level, planning is now universal. It's unimaginable in 2022 that a university could lack a sophisticated planning capacity, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. But at national system level, the picture is less clear. In Ireland, where the Institutes of Technology have been grouped into technological universities, and Wales, where on top of 2 decades of orchestrated mergers, a new kind of tertiary architecture is being developed, I think the position is reasonably clear. Less clear in Scotland, although colleges have been rationalised on a regional basis. Not at all clear in England, where the OFAIRS does a lot of regulation and ideological meddling perhaps, but almost no overt planning. Well, of course, in practice, that regulation and meddling amount to a national planning framework. The term itself remains kind of taboo. Next, kind of geopolitical and economic rivalry. More than ever, universities are seen as factories producing productive and impactful knowledge that can be used to gain competitive advantage in a globalized economy. But this is now overlaid, I think, in confusing ways with heightened geopolitical tensions. Once the recruitment of students from China was seen as evidence of the global reputation of our universities and a triumph for kind of soft power, now it's almost as likely to be seen as a threat to national security. And that's another tough one, I think, for university leaders and planners. Next, academic excellence. The rhetoric of excellence is now pervasive. It's everywhere. The best, and even sometimes world-class universities, things have to be world-class these days, and the rest, of course, but they're not talked about so much. The best performing courses, Ref, Kite international excellence in research, and so on and so on. Now, some of this, of course, in some of its forms, is just kind of frothy corporate-style marketing. Some of it is driven by ever-proliferating league tables. I'm sorry, Matt. Some, of course, by accountability instruments. I mean, one of the definitions is we're facing with multiple definitions of excellence: academic merit, market appeal, value for money, but it's a language inevitably that we all have to speak and answer to, and we have to build it into higher education planning. Somewhat in tension with excellence is access and participation. In every higher education system, there's a stark imbalance of opportunities, with young people from the most advantaged social groups between 3 and 4 times more likely to have access to higher education. And of course, the imbalance is even more marked in the more selective universities. And almost everywhere, there is a policy determination, at least to mitigate this imbalance. Of course, the details differ. In England, the focus is on universities helping to raise school attainment. In Scotland, contextual admissions, i.e. adjusted offers, are also emphasised. The wider policy drivers are also vary. Sometimes it's rather old-fashioned social democratic concern with social justice. In other places, it's linked to more ideological agendas, such as levelling up in England. And of course, there's always the danger of a backlash from the privileged who feel that they may be on the wrong end of social engineering. And they, of course, inevitably will go on about excellence. But despite all this, access is a key presence on the policy scene. Finally, what I like to call datification, now that's a rather ugly word, that has many different origins. One is the decline in trust. We no longer take things for trust. We want to see the data. There's an extensive academic literature on the rise of the ordered society. And this is important for universities because once they were highly trusted, and that trust was a key element of their autonomy. Closely linked, I think, is competition between institutions. We need the data to validate our claims. But its most important source, I think, is the sheer power of modern data systems. Dashboards, algorithms, artificial intelligence coming fast down the tracks. Now, I'll talk more about this later in the talk. Here, I just want to emphasize that this is now how we do business at a national system level and in institutions. So to summarize the first part of my talk, setting the scene, there are 2 things that are not going to go into reverse: mass expansion, heading fast toward near universal levels of participation in and education and training beyond school, and the involvement of the state, whatever form that might take. So we should really stop speculating about things that aren't going to happen, shrinking universities or the small state. Now, I've tried to list what I think are the key policy trends: politicisation, planning, or perhaps not planning in the case of England, economic and now sharpened geopolitical rivalry, academic excellence, with always multiple meanings, access and datification. Having set the scene in this way, I now want to move on to the second part of my talk. In this part, I want to discuss the development of planning in universities. Once I think it was an almost decorative activity that touched very little on the inner life of institutions, and because universities enjoy by today's standards a very high degree of autonomy, was of limited interest to outside stakeholders as well. In the early days of the move towards mass higher education, strategic plans were often essentially campus master plans designed to match buildings and infrastructure to the university's academic ambitions, which in most cases were to advance on a very wide and undifferentiated front. In addition, of course, annual reports and statements of accounts were published, as they still are, which typically satisfied the limited curiosity of external stakeholders, which in those days was less complicated, was quite limited in number, funding councils, bankers, and the like. Now, all this has changed for a number of reasons. First, universities have become much larger institutions with tens of thousands of students, thousands of staff, and much larger budgets running into hundreds of millions of pounds. So decisions about priorities and resource allocation become much bigger too, and more difficult. Second, the increasing cost of higher education, forcing it to compete more fiercely with other publicly funded activities, creating the need to seek greater efficiency. And as public funding becomes more constrained, the need to seek out alternative fundings. Third, the growth of the system produced fragmentation into sectors, different kinds of institutions, mission groups, and the rest. As a result, the kind of solidarity of the more traditional university system, subject of course to a widely accepted hierarchy of institutions within it, was eroded. The amount of shared ground shrank. Fourth, universities became much more complex and heterogeneous universities. New subjects, many of them with pronounced vocational or professional orientation, new modes of delivery, more strategic and applied types of research, new economic and community responsibilities. And as a result of this diversification, former, which I think were often tacit assumptions about decision-making and planning, had to be replaced by much more explicit ways of establishing priorities. And finally, of course, higher education, or to any rate universities, were no longer a kind of secret garden as their autonomy diminished. The demands of accountability increased, refs, TEFs, and the rest, and their external engagements proliferated, anchor institutions, innovation hubs, and all that kind of thing. For all these reasons, and some more probably, universities needed to develop more kind of rigid, stronger structures, scaffolding, clearest, and planning, I think, has provided that kind of scaffolding. Now, in the views of some disgruntled academics, we have too much planning, high-level strategic plans, strategies for learning and teaching, student experience, research access, people, lots more. And then we have operational plans with milestones and targets, monitoring plans to assess progress and performance, swathes of more specific action plans. Now that, I think, is a very unfair and overblown criticism, although it's not actually that uncommon. But there is a need, but I think there is a need to be quite rigorous about what plans we really need. It's sometimes too easy just to set up a kind of another task force and write another plan. The example of the National Health Service, I don't think is very encouraging in that respect. With the multiple levels of plans, many of which have little impact on frontline services. Often, I think, because the difficult and most politically difficult issues are kind of swerved. And I suspect in some aspects of university planning, there's a kind of similar displacement at work. But of course, the answer is not to downgrade planning, but to streamline it and make it better informed by evidence. And here I want to talk about four things. First, the level at which planning takes place, national, institutional, or individual unit. Second, the scope of plans, core and enabling plans. Third is various types, strategy, operations, monitoring, compliance, and so on. And finally, of course, closely linked, its objectives, perhaps to mobilize support, boost profiles, monitor progress, satisfy external stakeholders, and inevitably its multiple audiences. I've already mentioned planning at a national or system level. As I've said, England is a bit of an outlier in this respect, with its excess, I would say, of control and interference and apparently absence of explicit planning on the grounds that the market does the job. Of course, as I said earlier, of course, all the control and surveillance apparatus produces a framework for planning. And I would argue the honest thing probably is to acknowledge this, so its goals and assumptions can be properly examined. But I think there's now a general acceptance that the most important part of planning takes place within institutions, not at the national level. Not just in the UK and Ireland, but across most developed higher education systems. A more interesting question for me, partly because it's not talked about that much, under the general heading of the most appropriate level for planning, is the right balance between whole institution plans and subunit plans. Should faculty, departmental and unit planning essentially amount to delivery plans for institutionally mandated goals, or should it be much more bottom-up? Personally, I have a preference, I think, in principle, in what Eurospeak was called subsidiarity, especially in the case of academic units. It may be different for support units. Next, the scope of planning. What I have in mind here is the distinction between core strategies and enabling strategies and plans. Core strategies address the primary purposes of higher education. Education, which embraces both learning and teaching and the wider experience of students, and research, which of course has a broader definition under contemporary conditions, scholarship and research, pure and applied, and so on. But I don't think that definition of research should be taken so far that it kind of covers business development and innovation, a rather wobbly term in my view. Now, some of you may well object that I'm being rather too narrow, even conservative, and I know that nowadays education is sometimes seen as a means to an end, high skill and high paid graduate employment, and research activity similarly as a means to another end, increased economic wealth and social well-being and higher productivity. But I would argue that, important as these things are and inevitable in mass higher education systems, they're still not the primary purposes of higher education. Enabling strategies I see as finance, buildings, infrastructure and equipment, and what we now tend to call people strategies. And just they're enabling, not core, because there's a danger that as a result of the corporatization of institutions, and maybe the marketization of some higher education systems, they can be mistaken for primary purposes. But unlike a PLC, a university is not designed to produce better financial results for its shareholders, increased turnover, larger surpluses, important as these things are in terms of financial stability and viability. And people strategies, I suspect, are often an expression of the desire to manage staff in the most efficient way possible to maximize institutional performance and productivity in the same semi-commercial and certainly corporatist framework, a very far cry away from old-fashioned ideas of collegiality. Third, the explosion of planning within higher education makes it very important, I think, to distinguish between different types. A first type is those performative statements, mission statements, often simplified perhaps into marketing documents, and more crudely still translated into brands or even logos. A second type are strategic plans, which were once, as I said earlier, written in more aspirational or even utopian terms, and maybe there were elaborations of those performative statements. But nowadays are much more likely to be expressed in more corporate language and therefore closer to the third type, which are operational plans, which set out goals and targets along the way. In some ways, I think these have become the key documents in university planning. A fourth type is plans, or maybe better still, instruments to monitor progress towards meeting these targets. Sometimes, of course, the third and fourth types are combined, with operational plans being frequently updated. But despite these overlaps, I think it's still worth actually trying to keep this typology in sight. Otherwise, there's a kind of danger that different kinds of planning aiming to do different things become hopelessly confused. I think this is especially important because university planning now has multiple goals and multiple audiences. One is certainly to create a stronger sense of common purpose across an institution, to mobilize wide internal support, to kind of create a compelling narrative, or if you like, story about the institution. And this is why the process of formulating plans is so important as the product itself. A more untidy plan that is a result of widespread engagement across an institution, I believe, is likely to be more effective in this respect than a carefully crafted plan produced by a small cabal, certainly if it's been with the dubious help of external consultants. But I'm not sure the same considerations apply when we have the second goal in mind, to impress external stakeholders and to burnish the external profile of the institution. Although, of course, we have always to remember, I think, that the individual members of staff are the best ambassadors, the best marketeers for any institution. This audience, I think, needs to be addressed in a different way. For example, if you like, shameless bragging about league table performance is fine, however much it may strain academic scruples internally. And another goal of university planning, of course, is to ensure that an institution is seen as complying with external requirements. I mean, here there is no choice, of course. Once again, it was once relatively simple, annual reports and accounts to satisfy formal reporting requirements, especially in terms of finance. But of course, compliance, like many other things, has exploded. Student numbers, progression of performance, governance codes, employment, and increasingly consumer law, health and safety, security in different forms, conduct and ethical standards. And all this before the OFS in English really gets to work. Now, I've gone into some detail here, but the main point I want to emphasize is simple. Planning now comes in so many types, shapes, and forms. This makes it more important to grasp its sheer complexity, and that only can be done by more rigorously identifying the multiple strands. Once planning was simple and easy to understand, if not always to appreciate by those disgruntled academics, no longer, I think, it's inevitable that planning has become a pervasive activity in higher education for reasons I have gone into, perhaps in too much detail. This brings me to the third part of my talk. In it, I want to focus more directly on two elements in universities most impacted by the pervasive nature of planning. One is obvious, the planning units themselves and departments which have to do the heavy lifting, but the other is governing bodies, which are now expected to play a much more active role and have had extra responsibilities placed on them, notably with regard to academic quality and standards, and a degree of activism and responsibilities that some doubt governing bodies as they currently are can actually really sustain. Now, I hesitate to say too much about planning units, but I'm very conscious that most of you are much more expert in that than I am. So I confine myself to a few broad points. The first is that I believe the positioning of these units in universities is crucial, not just organisationally, but in terms of how they're perceived by the wider university community. I think it's essential their role is seen as positive, supportive, and developmental, rather than in terms of surveillance, compliance, and control. Now, although surveillance, compliance, and perhaps control cannot be avoided, they shouldn't be seen as the central to their work. It's too easy in a framework that regards the university essentially as a corporate organisation, rather than a community of staff and crucially students, to overemphasise control at the expense of development. The second and logical extension, I suppose, is that it needs to be recognised the core business of universities is higher education and student learning and research in its wider sense. People and financial strategies, however crucial, are means to those ends. It follows that planning, I think, must start with these core objectives, and that these are built into any systems and processes that are developed. My third point follows from that. By its nature, I think, planning in universities should be highly distributed, with many of the most creative and innovative plans being developed at the grassroots in academic departments and research units, even if some of the people involved actually don't recognise they're engaged in formal planning. I think instead we often emphasise what I would call macro planning at the centre, in terms of strategic goals, institutional objectives, rather than this essential, highly distributed kind of micro planning. The role of my planning units, it seems to me, is of course to translate those high-level goals and objectives into concrete plans and to communicate them more widely. But it's also, I think, to provide that wider distributed community of planners distributed across the university with the right tools and data. My final point is that among those tools, and as important as operational plans and targets, is institutional research which supports them. I support, for reasons which should be clear from my first 3 points, the widest possible scope for institutional research. It should not be focused too narrowly on providing the data needed for macro planning at the strategic level, undertaken by senior managers and then endorsed by governing bodies, but also the data needed by micro planners in a university's basic academic units. For example, of course, the best possible data on trends in student demand or graduate employment is very important, and that which can be obtained by the use of analytics. But so too, I think, is data on learning, softer data perhaps, on learning and teaching, changing student learning styles, new patterns of knowledge production and research, which actually may need different kinds of methods, including practitioner and actual research to a much greater degree. The second element is governance. Here I'm thinking about governance in a formal and legal sense, governing bodies and their committees. I know we often use governance in a wider sense to include all the elements in developing scenarios, decision-making, monitoring and accountability. And personally, I prefer this wider definition, not least because it can sometimes appear that governing bodies are actually spectators to some degree in the game of university governance in this wide sense. But today, governing bodies I want to focus on in relation to planning and institutional research. I don't propose either to go into a lot of detail about the debates about the role, standing, and legitimacy of governing bodies. Instead, I want to focus on 2 headline trends. The first is that the expectations and natural demands placed on governing bodies have substantially increased. The most obvious is the responsibility for academic standards and quality, which was previously regarded effectively as subcontracted to senates and academic boards, or maybe really subcontracted to discipline-based communities, the so-called academic tribes. And I think governing bodies, frankly, have struggled to discharge these responsibilities, often by setting up committees focused on quality, with education involved as well, often bracketed, I think, with the wider student experience. But almost as important as these specific additional responsibilities placed on governing bodies is a kind of rising tide of more generalized expectations that they must actively own institutional strategies rather than simply sign them off, and that they are more heavily responsible and directly responsible for institutional performance. The second headline trend is that despite these increasing responsibilities and increasing burden on governing bodies, they haven't changed that much, really. They have tended to become smaller, although that can be exaggerated, and the representation of the academic community has also been reduced. They have struggled to become more diverse and have had some success, I think, in terms of gender and ethnicity, although if you actually look at the educational and professional backgrounds of members, regardless of their gender and ethnicity, it remains pretty monochrome. But their key constitutions have not changed, bar a few tweaks. Their members are largely volunteers. In a sense, they're not paid, unlike members of most analogous public bodies, analogous bodies in the public sector, and of course, directors of companies. And as a result, I think there are very strict limits on what extra can be expected of them. It's not clear to me either that they've been given the new tools needed to do their new, unenhanced job. A key tool, and the only one I really want to focus on this morning, is the deficit in terms of access to independent data. Governing bodies remain almost entirely dependent on the data provided for them by university executives, or available from public sources like HEIR, stats, or league tables, but often this has been filtered through the executives, or actually probably the media. Now, even in the past, this rather restricted access to independent information was sometimes difficult to reconcile with their responsibility for overseeing the performance of the university's senior managers. And I'm always worried about those rather glib phrases about governors being critical friends, because I think it's a nice phrase that kind of glosses over far too much. Now, this is in contrast to the dedicated staff, including research staff, available to the regents and trustees of big American universities. Now, I appreciate it will be impossible fully to reproduce the kind of elaborate and costly governance support infrastructure characteristic of many US institutions. But can we think in terms of some halfway houses, perhaps planning units, and in particular institutional research capacity that have twin track lines of accountability to both executives and to governing bodies? Or administrative support for governing bodies that are not simply provided by university executives on their own terms. And I'm not thinking just here of outsourcing clerking and things like that. Now, maybe these are rather bad ideas, but I continue to believe that we're expecting governing bodies to do new jobs, but we have to give them the tools to do those jobs. And that enhanced research capacity must be a crucial part of that mix. I'm probably running out of time, and I'm aware that institutional research has a much wider remit than supporting university or departmental planning even. Perhaps its most important responsibility, as I said earlier, is to look at student learning and course effectiveness, often at fine-grained level, and also the changing characteristics and therefore needs and expectations of students, a kind of emerging important issue which we actually understand very little, I think, perhaps because students themselves don't always understand it that well. And these local institutional research studies, I think, need to complement and occasionally qualify the rather broad brush, high-level policy research, often, as I've said, sadly, with a strong ideological overlay, and also external academic research, which can sacrifice timeliness for rigor and, of course, is aimed at producing reputable publications. So forgive me for focusing on just one aspect of institutional research, and perhaps not very much at that right. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I look forward to any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was an absolutely fascinating conversation and speech. Got a couple of questions in the chat, but if you don't mind, I'm going to take the first one if that's okay. Sitting in Wales and sitting in a devolved nation, I was really fascinated by the first conversation we had around the tensions between the devolved nations. And I just listed a couple of things that, for me, sitting in Wales, what's going on in England is a big challenge. So NSS, recently consultation around different survey, perhaps in England and in the devolved nations, the whole conversations around fees and foundation year fees. There may be a reduction in England. What does that mean for devolved nations? Changes around quality assurance and the QAA. That whole balance around tertiary, which you touched on, and of course in Wales we've got a Tertiary Act coming through any day now. And then finally TEF, you know, Scotland has already noted they will come out, and likely Wales will follow. So I think my question was, is that a recipe for chaos? It's very difficult, I think, in a devolved nation to not be impacted by what goes on in England and how large the English sector is, and perhaps the power and the changing power of the Office for Students. So reflections, I think, about how that might pan out. Probably asking you to predict the future is a bit interesting, but just a view on that is really interesting.
I think one of the problems is that we've never really come to grips with devolution and what it means. I mean, we need to start thinking federally in the UK, and we don't really think like that at the level of Whitehall and Westminster. And in many ways, devolution had a retrograde effect because, of course, England feels it's just responsible for itself, yet inevitably the decisions taken in England impact particularly fiercely on Wales, I think, but obviously to some degree on Scotland as well. So we really need to sort this out, really. But if looking at the political conversations about devolution, of course, including independence in the case of Scotland, it's very difficult to see the kind of where the goodwill is generated at the high political level to produce that kind of proper conversation. And officials, of course, it's more difficult for them without that high-level political endorsement to do that themselves. I mean, you mentioned quite a few, of course. I mean, I think OFS attitude to the QAA, or perhaps the QAA's attitude towards OFS, was really a decision taken purely in an English context, without much thought to what the consequences might be for Wales and Scotland. Scotland to some extent has detached itself from that because the QA in Scotland has always very fiercely emphasised quality enhancement, and that's become to a degree a separate stranded development. But things like the NSS and the TEF, as you mentioned, these are taken by the UK government acting as an English government. They are no longer responsible, they feel, for what happens in Wales or Scotland. But the Welsh and Scottish governments don't have equal clout in these discussions. So I see it as a very unstable situation. It's apparent not just in education, but I think in several other fields as well, obviously.
Indeed. Thank you. I'd like to bring Matt in for his question, which was posed right at the beginning of your chat around what the impact of market forces have been on quality. Matt.
Thank you, PC. Yes, I mean, I've felt for a long time that higher education has not been enhanced by market forces, but when you mentioned the other parastate entities, it got me thinking about, well, you know, no one seems to be happy with train services. Recently, during the heat wave, everyone was complaining about leakages in that all our water companies are meant to oversee, and it got me questioning whether there's any evidence from any of these entities that market forces have driven up quality or sparked innovation.
Well, I'm sure. I think that would be going too far. I mean, I think I'm relatively sceptical about the application of market forces in what are effective monopoly services. I'm a bit sceptical about the application of market forces in areas like higher education, where basically people make one consumer choice. They're not making multiple consumer choices. So that's a very different context from a true market. But I think we need to recognise a market has always existed in a different sense in higher education. There's always been competition between institutions for students. Students have chosen institutions. Academics have chosen which jobs to go for and so on. But I think it's been contained within a different kind of set of values. I think the problem is we've now got a very reductionist set of values about what equates to success in terms of markets. And I think you're right to point out that sometimes that has a rather problematical relationship with kind of maintaining academic quality, at least in a traditional sense. And of course, we have contradictions. I think many politicians, even on the right, fundamentally don't believe in markets. They actually know what the right outcomes are. They know what is academic quality. And if the market produces different results, they don't like that. But actually, if you're accepting market logic, you have to accept as valid the outcomes the market produces, even if you think they're not producing the right outcomes, i.e. not enough STEM graduates, you know, dumbing down the wrong kind of courses, etc., etc.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I've sort of got a phrase in my mind. I think the parastate governance of higher education, I think, has led to more parasite entities within the sector than we had before. There's a lot of money going into the wrong hands at the moment, and I think we were better off before when it was more explicit that we were funded and had that autonomy that you were describing. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We've got two other points in the chat. So one is around that point you made around central versus distributed planning. And certainly, you know, in my institution, we work with an institutional plan strategy, of course we do. And the translation of that down to subject areas is really important. But the question from Claire. Claire, are you comfortable to come forward and ask your question to Peter?
I will attempt to do so. Please bear with me. I think it's quite ill-formed, so I'll try not to kind of take up too much time trying to fumble my way towards it. My own kind of primary sort of professional role is in educational development, so I connect in with institutional research and planning. And your reflections really resonated with me because we're having a lot of debate about how much more distributed educational development is and should be. That it's not just those of us who sit in central units who have educational development in our title who are involved in this sort of activity. But then that brings on the question of how we keep all of that, all of those differing contributions of people who perhaps don't identify as planners or institutional researchers or educational developers, but are contributing to the work. how we connect up that broader kind of work, and how we support the community, and we actually kind of make sure that the activity is coherent. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was kind of what I was thinking about.
Yes, well, I mean, I think you've identified a kind of a key dilemma, really, and that is the right balance between allowing lots of development at the grassroots, but giving it some kind of shape. And I think the challenge of institutional planning is to give that kind of shape. Now, occasionally, sometimes there will be direct conflicts between what people want to do in basic units and actually what is really seen as in the best interest of the institution. There might be kind of issues to do with resources and so on. But I think one should try. The worst kind of plan, I think, is one that is a very nice plan at the high institutional level. It reads a wonderful strategy. But actually, the connection with actually what's happening lower down in the institution is quite limited. Just to reminisce for a moment, when I was at the University of Leeds, I taught on a kind of master's program, and one of the tricks we did was that we kind of anonymized university mission statements, and then there was a list of institutions, and asked students to match one to the other. And actually, first of all, the mission statements are all remarkably similar. And secondly, it was really incredibly difficult to match one to the other. And that kind of made a sort of point, which I think is still valid.
Thanks very much, Claire. Finally, and hopefully this will come back to your passion, Peter, around widening access and participation. So, a question from Rachel around the OFS and their new approach, but what that might mean. Rachel, are you happy to come in?
Yeah, I can get my buttons working. Thanks very much, Peter, for a really interesting talk. I've got quite a long question, so maybe just pick bits that you want to do. But yeah, I was really interested in your thoughts on the new approach OFS are taking, particularly a new focus on raising attainment in schools. Wondering, if that is a signal of a sort of move back to the access agreements that we started out with, perhaps. And given your comment on too many plans, would our APP agendas be better off integrated, embedded in our overall university strategic plans? And then just if you could perhaps share some of your experiences as Commissioner for Fair Access in Scotland, is there anything that other countries could learn from that approach? Thank you.
Yes, well, obviously, I mean, there has, as you know, been quite a radical shift with the change of personnel in OFS in terms of the direct for access and participation. And now the focus seems to me too much on just raising attainment in schools, as if that was the whole answer. And of course, we know that's not the whole answer. A couple of years ago, I wrote a special report on the kind of impact of COVID on widening access up in Scotland. And it was absolutely apparent that schools that were worst hit and had the most disruption, the pupils that had the least support were, of course, those who were already disadvantaged. And to assume that everyone starts from a somehow level playing field, or that universities themselves have the power or ability to kind of level a playing field, which reflects fundamental social inequalities, strikes me as misplaced. I think a more flexible approach is not just that we have to get. I think there's a view of access which is fundamentally a kind of deficit one. There individuals have deficits, and we will do our best to address those deficits so they can meet our standards, that we don't have to change at all. And I think a more radical view of widening participation and fair access means that we have to change a bit ourselves. So the idea of contextual offers, which clearly OFS is increasingly unhappy about, I think is still an important tool, because universities, after all, are trying to assess the applicants with the greatest potential. And it's trite to say that people with kind of pretty good grades from a very deprived school or probably have more potential than people who have very good grades from a highly advantaged school. So universities they're not engaging in social engineering here. They're trying to do the traditional thing, which is to pick out the applicants who have the greatest potential to succeed on their courses. And what's wrong with that? You made a point about access and participation plans themselves. I mean, there is a tendency when things become part of a compliance framework, you have to have that kind of plan, that it does become slightly separate from the whole institution planning aspect. It becomes a bit detached. And I think on the whole, it's much better if it's embedded so that actually it's not just part of one of the things we have to comply with, but actually it's become part of the core mission of the institution. I mean, my experience as Commissioner in Scotland, I think, has been fascinating in many ways. It's obviously been helped by the fact that there's strong political support for this at the highest level, from the First Minister downwards. Secondly, there's cross-party support. All the parties support this. No one objects to it. And to some extent, it kind of resonates with how people in Scotland see the distinctives of their higher education. It's a more open system. Now, to some degree, this is a bit of a myth, but it's a very powerful kind of historical myth, and I think it's made it easier to see access as a kind of central part of university missions. So on the whole, I've been very impressed. I mean, OFS, I knew Chris pretty well. I'm afraid I never met the current occupant of his role.
Thanks very much. I'll draw us to a close there, Peter. Once again, thank you ever so much for a fantastic speech, really thought-provoking, very interesting, resonating with lots of us in the room, I'm sure. We now have a 10-minute break, so colleagues can take a comfort break, get a cup of coffee. We'll be back at 11:05 with Dr. James Newham, who'll be talking to us about mental health analytics. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you.